in there, there's all the details, just a treasure trove of information. And thanks to Google Books nowadays, you can actually go back and look at these century-old texts that they were referring to online and get a lot of great information. And so this has kind of been a passion of mine, and Jim asked me to speak here today. So given power ships, in Navy, and I thought I'd come up with this one here in the Bennington. July 21st, 1905, she exploded here in San Diego Harbor, lost 65 lives, and 11 of the survivors will receive the Medal of Honor for their bravery. And like I said, it was one of California's greatest maritime disasters. So the Bennington started off, actually let me go back here. So this is Commander Lucia Young, who was the captain of the vessel. I hardly anticipate the Lieutenant Blue, who's the XO, will rejoin the ship, very much to my regret. If not, then will leave me with only 4 duty officers, young and inexperienced, which I likely will destroy the fine record we have in this vessel and keep the standard. I must have 2 experienced officers. Very profound words, because he had the foresight to see that the lack of manpower was a huge factor in the fate that the Bennington would succumb to. So built by Palmer Company of Chester, Pennsylvania, almost $5.5 million. Keel of the Bennington was laid down in June 1888, launched on June 3rd. 1890 is the third of the Yorktown class, the Concord being the second vessel of the same design. She's placed 1,710 tons, equipped with 6-inch breech-loading rifles, 4 6-pounders, 1 4-pounder, rapid-firing guns, and 2 30-pound Colts. 30 caliber Colts. By the way, I could spend several hours talking about the disaster and so forth, but I focus more on the vessel itself and the explosion and the cause of the explosion. So she's powered by 2 horizontal triple expansion engines, produced 3,392 horsepower, which could propel the ship up to 17 knots. You had coal bunkers, a capacity of 391 tons, gave a range of 4,262 miles with endurance cruise of 10 knots under power. Now you see back in the day she was schooner rigged. It's actually designed to extend her range and time at sea. She was built to replace some aging vessels of the Civil War era. The modern Yorktown class gunboats were designed similar to the British torpedo cruiser class, contributing to a modern all-steel U.S. Navy. Although formerly known as gunboats, they were informally addressed as third-rate cruisers. The Bennington was commissioned on June 20th, 1891 as Patrol Gunboat 4, despite the absence of a 10-inch forward gun. Joining the squadron of Evolution, the new member of the United States Navy served in the Atlantic in October 1892, was given the odd assignment of towing replicas of Columbus, Vina, and Pinta across the Atlantic from Hilda, Spain, for New York, commemorating Columbus's 400th anniversary. These vessels would eventually become key exhibits at the World's Columbian Exposition, better known as Chicago's World Fair of 1893. She saw duty off Alaska, preventing seal poachers, and off Central America, addressing some of the social upheaval. In 1895, she headed to Mare Island for repairs and maintenance, particularly on her boilers. Each tube of her, in her 4 badly leaking boilers was leaking. So here we have some other deck shots. Obviously her stern. Looks like a bow looking out. So the Engineer McGee, president of the Board of Survey of the Bennington, these boilers are so built that when the furnace doors are open to supply the first cold air, it can rush directly against the fire in the tubes, causing great contraction. A few weeks of such wrenching is sufficient to loosen the tubes at the end and permit leaking. We want to say these boilers are simply nuisances. They leak all the time, and after a day or so of use, it cannot be stopped. This has been explained again and again to the department by the chief engineers. Later found out the crown sheet collapsed on one of the was later found contaminated with grease. Okay, that's important because we'll come back to that later as a major factor in the explosion. The Board of Inquiry found that the burning out of the crown sheet is an accident liable to occur at the time of the type of boilers, such as are on the Bennington, Yorktown, Concord, that class vessel. So basically, the boilers were about 12 feet in diameter. You have 3 large tubes going at the bottom of them, and the tubes over a period of time would contain the coal, and the roofs would collapse downward from pressure. So when heated, they would weaken and become forced downward. So in 1899, the Bennington sailed from Wake Island to claim it for the United States, and later saw combat action in the Spanish-American War. In 1901, her boilers were retubed and tested to a cold pressure of 225 psi. Chief engineer of the ship requested a complete overhauling of lifting gear, stop valves, and safety valves having been removed. The machine additionally requested the furnaces be overhauled, but all they received was jacking up of the two little furnaces in boiler A. So basically what happens is that when the boilers came down, the furnaces came down, they heated them back up, jacked them up, put them back in place. It was kind of a band-aid measure. The engineering officer noted, "I consider the boilers unreliable, and this weakness makes it impossible to share a greater speed than 7 knots per hour while steaming in squadron." Bureau of Steam Engineering ordered the pressure of the boilers reduced from 160 to 145. Commander Niles, the Bennington, noted, "Should the condition of the boiler furnaces grow worse, urgent necessary for going to the Navy Yard may arise." Okay, in 1904, Commander Lucian Young took command of the gunboat. So, "Made my official inspection through the entire ship. There had been a great deal of criticism in regard to the boilers. The condition of the engine dependencies, except for the boilers, are good. The condition of the boilers is poor. They will probably give service for a definite period unless duly called upon." Noting the report made by the chief machinist, Young requested the report and found that they reduced the safety valves, again from 145 pounds, which is a recognition of the fact that the boilers were weak. And under these conditions, I consider no boiler safe. Okay, in September 30th, 1904, the boilers are in poor condition, something like pinning shells noticeable in the water line. The internal stays are in fair condition. The internal feed pipe, the wall boilers, and renewing the furnaces are in very poor condition. They all drop from 1 inch to 2.5 inches. So again, the roof of the furnaces has collapsed significantly. Fractures have occurred in 3 of the furnaces and have been plugged. Upon examination, it was found to be only 1/8 inch in thickness, with about 5 inches around the fracture, varying to original thickness of 1/2 inch along the fire line. So in July 1905, Commander Young wrote to the Admiral, "Everything's now in excellent condition with the exception of the boilers, which, although tested at 225 pounds of water pressure, I find will not be safe to subject to a steam pressure of 130 to 135 pounds, but would enable us to make 11 to 12 knots full speed." Here's a picture of the crew. This is pretty much the infamous picture made in spring 1905 before the disaster. Here we have some of the officers, Commander Young, right here, he later became Vice Admiral. And we have another photograph here of the crew. This is Charles Wade, he's the engineer. We have Yates, the Peck, the ship surgeon. And down here, can't quite see it, but he's holding the anteater, which was their mascot aboard the ship. So in July of 1905, the Bennington came back from Hawaii to San Diego and had a rough crossing on board. The XO, Victor Blue, who was referenced earlier, had some type of appendicitis issue and had to be taken to Mare Island for medical treatment. So in the evening of July 20th, 1905, Commander Young was dining at the Hotel Del when he received word to assist the Wyoming that threw a prop or something, had some mechanical issues, Port Hartford, which is now San Luis Obispo. And the Bennington was to sail as soon as she could to Port Hartford and to tow the Wyoming back to Mare Island. So they prepared for sea. And one of the things they did here was you had 2 junior watermen or oil tenders, DeCortani and Holland, were set up to prepare their boilers. And here you see 2 valves. This is actually taken after the disaster. We have 1 valve here and 1 valve here. And what they did is this valve remained closed, this one open. So this fed the steam pressure gauge. So what happened is you have 0 pressure. So initially, when the boiler's heating up, they saw at 0 pressure, so what do? You throw in more coal, more coal, and you fire as hard as you can. Not very good on a weak boiler. So unknowingly, like I said, he switched the valve the wrong way, opening up to air, and they discussed that there's something wrong with the boiler. They didn't quite understand what it was. So on boiler A, which is next to it, identical in all dimensions, reaching 135 pounds. D. Cortani connected to the other two boilers, C and D, and they remarked, "I don't like to take a fire on this old boy, it's too dangerous." D. Cortani noticed a stream of steam shooting out about 4 inches wide, about 2 feet long from the seam between the inboard furnace and the outside casing of boiler B. Sent one of the coal passers forward then to fetch the boilermaker. "We got a leak, we need to fix it." Here's the log from the chief mate, which is Charles Wade. From midnight 8 a.m., steam on boiler C for auxiliary purposes. Started boiler D at 4 a.m. Recommenced coaling at 5:30 a.m., taking on fresh water from lighter alongside. Started hydrometers, which are basically jets taken from active boilers, help build up pressure and heat the water up faster. Boiler B at 6:45. Connected boiler D with C at 7 a.m. Prime furnaces for A and B. Finished coaling at 6:45. Commenced warming the main engine at 8:30. Steam on steering engine at 9:30. Turned over engine from signals from the bridge at 9:50. Connected up to boiler A and C and D at 10:30. So you notice the absence here of boiler B because they didn't know how much pressure there was in there. Steam formed A and B and that's the last of his entry when the explosion happened. So basically what happened here is, here we have the furnaces, the boiler, A and B and D. So this furnace roof pulled away from the face of the boiler here. Now, it wasn't steam that came out, it was water, because the steam forms above here. So this is essentially a water jet, about 130 psi. And what happens is that it's about 350 psi. When you all of a sudden explosively depressurize water like that, it forms steam. So at 10:30 a.m., the roof of the crown sheet, first number 2 boiler B gave way and tore from the face of the boiler, opening it out. And the tearing away of the 2 boilers severed steam pipes, so now all 4 boilers were flooding steam into the engineering spaces. And they describe this as, an explosive or a depressurization, which will explosively form steam, essentially from all 4 boilers. And it created like a hydraulic shock or a water hammer. And they said that there was 10 times the energy of a 13-inch gun, and it occurred with such force and spontaneity to crush pipes whose ends were open. So it was quite an explosive event here. Now this actually forced the boiler backwards. This is the settle mount. It forced it back about 17 feet into boiler D, and then boiler D backwards about another 7 feet until it hit the engine. So this is a huge amount of force. And in an instant, the fire room became a hellish pressure cooker filled with scorching hot steam, burning coal, and thick smoke. Now at the same time, boiler B and D, because they're forced off their settle mounts in position, the connection to the smokestack was broken. So now they're belching out thick coal steam inside, thick coal soot inside the engineering spaces. So it's estimated that some 27 men were killed outright, either by the physical force of the water and steam, searing of their lungs, smoke inhalation, lack of oxygen, or simply cooked alive. Here we see boiler B forced into boiler D. There's actually a bulkhead in between, they're just torn right out. So here's a crude drawing here of the vessel, just a simple cross section. We have boiler C and D and A and B forward. So boiler B was on the starboard side. And here you see connected to the stack. So this was forced backwards, the connection to the stack was broken, and B and D were forced back until it hit the engine. So down in San Diego, they have a very nice model of the Bennington. Perry is where the officer was standing, providing orders to prepare for sea. And the steam basically formed a pressure geyser and followed the path of least resistance, expanding through the engineering spaces into the deck above, finding any opening erupting from the smokestack, the deck of the basin stack, vents, hatches. Lieutenant Newman Perry stood in the starboard bridge, just having issued an order to raise the anchor, was hit by a blast of steam with such force to blast his clothing off and blow them down to the deck below. So here's a cross section of a better diagram. You can see here the steam, the path the steam took, basically knocked them off and blew his clothing off, and basically he was so badly scalded that his skin came off as well. Here's a photograph of him. He was the only officer killed in the event. His wife came down from San Francisco to meet him, and only hear his death shortly upon her arrival. Some of the bodies were boiled while those had to be cut from the wreckage. Those that died quick were lucky, but many died a very slow death. A surgeon would state that owing to the decomposition of the sloughed skin and flesh around the burns of the terrible odor attendant, the surgeon in charge was directed that picric acid be used when the wounds are dressed. The powerful acid destroys all the decomposed parts.
Thank you.
And we see kind of a makeshift morgue. And then up there at the Fort Rosecrans Cemetery, it's for a time known as the Bennington Cemetery down in San Diego, Oklahoma. Here we see those that are interned with a stick marking their headstones where they would be eventually placed. So the Bennington took on water. What happened was when the boilers gave way, it sheared off what's called the bottom blades, which is allowed the boilers to be drained with the water. Basically, you provide pressure in there, you open the valve, and the steam pressure displaces the water, forces out the ship. Those connections were broken, and so that water was allowed to flood the engineering spaces inside. So the Bennington became, started taking on water, took on a starboard list, and settled low. Here you can see some of the ash and soot on her side. She was beached right next to the Santa Fe Wharf. Once they found out the cause of the intrusion of water, which is again a couple of pipes, they were plugged. The diver went down to plug them, and she was pumped out and refloated. Here's an interesting story. John H. Turpin, would describe at the time, a finally formed fellow and a colored gentleman. He survived both the Maine and the Bennington explosions. So on July 31st, 10 days after the explosion, a court of inquiry was held on the Chicago and San Diego. We had Commodore Stevenson, Captain Moore, Captain T.S. Phelps, and Lieutenant Moody, Judge Advocate were present. And what the Navy likes to do is to find who's guilty. So the Admiral Ray, Chief Engineer of the Navy, says he can only account for the damage done to the Bennington by explosion of high explosives. It reiterates there's nothing in the reports of the Bureau to show that the boilers were in an unsafe condition.
Backtrack.
Didn't really look back at some of the records before he spoke. So Lieutenant Commander Bartlett, Fleet Engineer of the Pacific Squadron up in Mare Island, was assigned to investigate the explosion and directed 4 workmen to look for the valves in the wreckage. When the valve was found, do absolutely nothing with it, had it to be just as they found it. Bartlett had this idea that the boiler was overpressured, the safety valves were not working properly, and then it was the fault of the crew. So he went on to testify that rust and scale found inside the safety valve and arbitrarily determined that it certainly would not have blown off at the required pressure, 145 pounds, at which it was supposed to be set. Therefore, ineffective. By the close of the second day, the Judge Advocate demonstrated the valve leading to the pressure gauge was close to the boiler, preventing steam pressure from reaching the gauge and opened it to the air, so it read zero pressure. It's also suggested 2 pressure relief valves were found to be clogged with rust and scale, and the valves were poorly maintained. According to Bartlett, the boiler exploded from overpressure. The valve of the steam gauge was shut. The safety valve did not blow. The sentinel valve did not blow. The main stop valve was shut. The auxiliary stop valve was shut. There was no outlet anywhere for the steam within the boiler. So basically, it was overpressurization due to the neglect of the crew, which caused the explosion. Now, in the case of the Bennington boilers, they actually had 2 types of safety valves. One was simple spring, which I'll show you here in a moment. The other one was a sentinel valve, which is weighted, almost like a scale, which doesn't really work very well on a ship because as the ship goes up and down, rides the waves, that weight could essentially go up and down and prematurely open up the valve. And because it was exhausted inside, it could potentially burn someone. So they actually fixed the sentinel valves to a higher pressure so they wouldn't blow off. Now the safety valve remained in effect, and the safety valves continued to function, and they were redundant, so they did really need two valves. This is Charles Wade. He was a recent Annapolis graduate, put in charge of the engineering spaces. Now this is something new the Navy wanted to try in 1899. They came out with the Navy Personnel Act of 1899, which reorganized the U.S. Navy, changing the roles of staff and line officers, the placement of junior officers in charge of the engineering spaces, positions formerly held by experienced engineers. So even at the time, if you became a chief engineer, a master chief or so forth on a commercial vessel, you better have a decade or two of experience on you. In the case here, the Navy vessel, they put some junior officers in charge. He was charged with the failed to see the safety valve on boiler B was overhauled at the proper time, kept in good order, and accept the verbal statement of a subordinate that it had been overhauled the previous March. Further, that he was failed to keep the sentinel valves and the boilers in good working order as well. This is Commander Lucian at the time. He was one of the Navy's heroes. This is in Lexington, Kentucky, where he was a native of Kentucky. He had a life-saving medal and a beautiful sword that was awarded to him for his life-saving efforts above he was in the Navy above the Huron when it wrecked off the East Coast, and was recognized for his gallantry in assisting his fellow sailors on board the ship when it wrecked. He also jumped off to save a potentially drowning sailor, saving his life, and it was well regarded by those in the Navy. But whenever it hits the fan, the captain is always at fault. So they charged him with various charges as well of neglect. So here's a picture of the boiler, or the furnace inside the boiler, and you can see the corrugations here, much like a drainage culvert, providing a great deal of reinforcement and strength. Here's another photograph. Here is the safety valve of boiler D, when the pipes have broke off, and you can just see that there's catastrophic damage done to the vessel here. Now this is the most telling picture that anyone should be able to look at and determine what the cause was of the explosion. You have heavy steel, which is bent like a wet noodle. The only reason that would ever happen, I mean, you look at here, this is bent at 180 degrees, both sides. These corrugations are flattened out. You couldn't do this with like a 10-ton press. The only way this ever happens is if it overheats and becomes close, reaches the point of melting temperature. Its structure fails and it collapses. So here's another photograph. You can see where it just was forced back. And that's looking back from the face of the boiler back towards the forward bulkhead. And you see a lot of pipes and debris here scattered around. And you can see how the furnace tore away from the face. When this happened, described as ripping buttons off a shirt when the rivets gave way. So they set up a makeshift diagram here, trying to figure out what happened. So we see a lot of the components. We see the steam gauge. Here is the safety valve, which basically a spring. There's a valve to the boiler, the steam gauge, which I showed previously. The sentinel valve, which again was a weighted valve, which is not really good for having a ship that bounces up and down. Now, during the defense, there was a diver, Evans, quite an interesting character. He wrote a book about how to make a better Navy back in 1940. And he talks about his experience aboard the Bennington. basically sided with Charles Wade and went to his defense in the court-martial. This safety valve here, he took off another vessel, Petrel, which is very similar in design to the Bennington, and he went back to ship's log. He found, I think it was like 110 psi. He tested the valve and it still went off like 112, very, very close. Then he packed it full of sand, tested again, still worked. He packed it full of concrete, let it cure overnight, and then tested it, it still worked. So basically these valves will open like 1/100 of an inch to let steam out. And so the prosecution's argument, led by Bartlett, said that, well, it's full of rust, it didn't work. Well, it doesn't mean it's not gonna work, it just means it's full of rust. You're in the salt water, everything rusts. Especially since these valves here, because they're mounted horizontally, they had an opening above to the hull of the ship, above the level of the valve itself, so it's always going to trap salt water in there. It's kind of a poor design, but the fact that they rusted and corroded should only make it leak, but it should not make it not operate. And basically what it was is, here's a simple cutaway, just a big spring. Here's a manual relief on it, but you have like a cap nut. So you set your boiler for about 140 psi, whatever it was they want to set at. You undo the top nut until it starts to leak. Put another cap nut on top of it, make sure they're tight together, and now it's set for the right pressure that you want. So it's a very simple device. So in the morning of July 21st, the pressure of boiler A reached about 130 psi. It was maintained at that level once connected to boiler C and D. The pressure was brought up from near zero to 130 psi in boiler A. From 8 a.m. to 10:30, the average rate of pressure increases 0.87 psi per minute. By extrapolating this pressure for another 8 minutes to 10:30 at the time of the explosion, the pressure would have been increased by another psi, rising to 137 psi. By comparison, boiler B, identical to A, and heated near the same time, was hard-fired. It likely had greater pressure, but the pressure increase was even 10% higher in boiler B. The pressure at 1038 would have been 151 psi. The safety valve was set at 145 psi. It was successfully argued by the defense to have been in working condition. The safety valve exhausted to the hull on those topside would have easily hurt a vent, but none did suggest the pressure valve never reached 145 psi. So this really undermined the arguments from the prosecution during the court-martial. So basically, what caused the explosion? So in most catastrophes, the cause is one factor, it's the culmination of many. So the failure to skim or drain the surface water inside the boiler prior to draining. Okay, so Wade determined that the water in boilers A and B was hardened by normal use to drain them. Now mind you, the sailing up north to tow the Wyoming was something that happened last minute. They thought they had a couple of days in San Diego. Thought they might get some shore leave. Never did. And so he took that opportunity to drain the boilers A and B because of the hard water. And you get hard water, you get contamination, you're constantly distilling, and reclaiming that water, you get a lot of grease and other oils and stuff coming from lubrication from the engines. So during ordinary use, when draining the grease from the engine, the dynamos may enter the boilers. These oils, grease, or foaming organic substances flow on the surface of the water inside the boiler when it's cooled. To remove the surface scum, prevent it from coating the interior of the boiler when drained, the boilers were equipped with a scum cock, or a drain leading from the side of the boiler, which may remove some of the surface froth. For reasons unknown, the surface was not drained off. With the water lowered, the grease and organic material coated the inside of the boiler. The thickness of the coating increased the surface area, the water decreased as the two walls of the boiler came together at the bottom. Wide area at the top and just increases as it comes together at the bottom. As a result, the boiler bottom and the top of number 2 or center furnace were coated with the greatest amount of oil organic material. So any of you ladies, a little skin so soft in your bathtub, you drain it, what happens? The whole thing becomes slippery with oil. This oil organic material prevents the water from contacting the steel. You can actually have red hot steel submerged in water with that barrier in between. So this was a factor in the explosion. The valve to the pressure gauge was closed and the pressure gauge read 0. So Holland, on the direction of DeCortani, turned the valve between the boiler and the pressure gauge the wrong way, closing off the pressure gauge to the boiler so the gauge read 0 and continued to do so. Believing the boiler remained cold, is fed coal at a greater rate than boiler A. After watching the pressure gauge come on boiler A, one would venture to guess the two tenders must have realized the valve was switched incorrectly, the pressure gauge failed in some manner, but there's no evidence to suggest it ever happened. Regardless, it would not have been cause for immediate concern since once boiler B was connected to all the others, all 4 boilers would register near the same pressure, which could be read in several pressure gauges in the engineering spaces. Even if the error were realized, switching the valve setting was not an option since it required climbing on top of the hot boiler. So as you saw before, the valves were on top of the boiler, you had to climb up there. You're not going to do that, burn yourself. So hard fire was a contributing factor that collapsed the crown sheet. Based on the pressure gauge readings, believed the boiler B was cold and the boiler was initially fired hard, creating temperature fluctuation in the boilers, furnaces, and stressing them out. Poor personnel management by the Navy. Basically, the Navy was short on funds, very tight, was shorthanded, both officers and crew requiring over 20 to perform duties above their rate or grade, including those of DeCortani. He was an oilman. He was designed to basically drop oil and lubricate some of the moving parts. The chief machinist on the sick list and water tank was unavailable, leaving DeCortani and the oiler with no experience to operate the boilers. The officer in charge, Charles Wade, was charged with his own responsibilities and cannot oversee DeCortani, the acting water tender. More experienced officer, chief water tender, may have drained off the surface froth and know the wrong position of the valve and pressure gauge. Ensign Charles Wade was expected to oversee all activities in the boiler room, even though he's taxed to the point of receiving only 3 hours sleep the night before. Wade's inexperience in engineering was also criticized, drawing further criticism of the Navy's amalgamation with the placing of young and inexperienced officers in engineering spaces. The lifespan of the boilers was exceeded. Only minimal maintenance was performed. The normal life of locomotive type boilers was about 7 to 10 years. The Bennington's boilers were 15 years old. All 4 boilers had furnaces that had dropped with age and use, and 3 had patches. Now out of round, their strength is compromised as well. So an experiment, a similar boiler was tested at a failure point and exploded at 600 to 700 psi. Other tests determined that when the furnace crowns dropped, they reduced in strength down to 1/6 or a little more than 100 psi, similar to the 2 collapses that occurred in the Bennington. Ironically, boiler B was the best of the 4 boilers, having at least dropped the crown sheets and no patches, unlike the other 3. So, as I described, 10 years previously, Malapa, California, boiler D had a collapse of one of its furnaces. At the time, it was not catastrophic because the crown roof retained its connection to the face of the boiler, and so that it didn't have the catastrophic explosion that we see here. Okay, it had 2 valves, as pointed earlier, safety and sentinel valves. Both, if the safety and sentinel valves failed to open, increased by, they were, so they had tested these boilers to 225 psi cold, but it's different than a hot boiler because now you have the heat as a factor. So the holes in the boiler faces were punched, not drilled. During our construction, this process made imperfect holes, creating pressure points to the rivets, reducing their strength. Aging rivets failed to hold the ends of the crown sheet. As you saw, how it tore away from the face of the boiler. Softened with age, heat, and badly corroded, the rivets gave way when the crown sheet collapsed. So on the early morning of July 21st, 1905, the water level inside boiler B was drained, coating the inside with oil and organic material. The pressure gauge, which is open to the atmosphere and not connected to the boiler, read into 0, suggesting it was cold. To compensate for this, the boiler was fired hard. The temperature was quickly brought up in its furnaces. The crown sheet of the center furnace, insulated with a layer of oil and organic material, more than the other furnaces, grew red hot, giving its ability to transfer heat to the water inside. At 10:38 a.m., the roof of the furnace approached its melting point, whereupon it's lost its structural integrity and collapsed under pressure. The rivets that held the crown sheet to to the front and back of the boiler, compromised in strength by years of corrosion, cyclic exposure to heat, and held in unevenly punched holes, could not support the crown sheet. The rivets gave way and the crown sheet collapsed, opening the sealed boiler to the ship's interior. Water pressure at the top of the boiler shot 350-degree water out the opening at the bottom and into the boiler room. Once the pressure was relieved, the water explosively vaporized into steam with catastrophic consequences. The crown sheet collapsed in 1895 clearly demonstrates the furnace can fail at a pressure far less than the boiler's normal rated pressure. So in 1895, it occurred at 110 psi, even though the boiler was originally designed to withstand or operate at 160 psi. So during the court martial, which will probably cover a couple hours worth of presentations time, were exonerated and found not guilty. Epilogue. So Easter Sunday, 1906, 11 of the Bennington survivors received the Medal of Honor. Late 1908, it was thought that the gunboat would be repaired, and they allocated some $195,000 for repairs, but August 1910, Naval Board of Inquiry was convened to inspect the Bennington. They found that she was old and useless, so she was stripped of her bow ornaments, navigation gear, brass rails, anchors, chains, searchlights, guns, portable furniture, etc., and was stripped. Here she is shown in dry dock. Now, after she was towed from San Diego back to Mare Island, she was towed to Chicago, and around Angel Island they had a lot of currents going on, and the Bennington struck the Chicago, cut a hole in her prow, and bent the bow of the Bennington there. In 1908, they erected a spire. I'm not sure if anyone has been back to Bennington, Vermont. This was a model of that, and a smaller reproduction, to commemorate or recognize the 65 men that gave their lives for the Bennington. Now, one of the interesting follow-up stories of this is that one of her crewmen, Lee Strobel, wrote an article and pinned the blame of the Bennington explosion on the drunk petty officer based on hearsay. This was published in the United States Institute of Proceedings in 1969, long after all the other fellow crewmen had died. And he quotes, from our shipmates who regularly called on us to call to see us at arrival at Mare Island Naval Hospital, we learned that gross carelessness in liquor caused the accident. It was found that the boiler that exploded was sound and strong and had burst asunder only because of negligence, immediate and prolonged. Well, that's not true. The boilers were in bad shape, it needed repairs, never received the repairs, and I find it ironic that one of her own crew would damn her fellow crewmates for the disaster. And it's published in Proceedings. Up at Mare Island, there's an old church. They have a memorial dedicated to the Bennington, those that died. Here's down below is a list of the names. Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery. The spire still stands there, and you can see the headstones in the foreground. Myself and a few other people have met on ceremonies in July to commemorate and recognize the event. Following the court-martials, Cosmopolitan magazine, back in March 1907, released an article called Gross Caste in America, basically claiming that the elite, such as officers, were entitled to hold positions such as chief engineer. Using Bennington example, the author argued that boilers not explode without gross negligence or gross incompetence. It suggested the ensign was responsible for the explosion. Though Charles T. Way was never mentioned by name, the article did state that a young ensign, bookishly educated in engineering and trained to be equal efficient in the position, stepped from the bridge to the fire room and tried to experiment in cutting out the steam gauge and plugging up their safety valve. Well, those lives paid the penalty. It didn't sit well with Wade, who filed a $100,000 lawsuit against William Randolph Hearst's Cosmopolitan magazine. Here's a beautiful model of the Bennington at the time of the explosion. which you can see on display at the Berkeley down the San Diego Maritime Museum. And here you see in the background one of the boards from her lifeboats, or launches. Those that survived the disaster were given a pin recognizing their participation or involvement there with the explosion. So during the salvage, here was the boiler that was taken out. Supposedly they could ship it off to Annapolis, and at that time Wade was teaching there in Annapolis, so that would have been a ghost reminder that followed across country, but I can't find a record that ever ended up back in Annapolis. So the Bennington was cut down. Basically, her main deck is all that was left. Cut down some of her super weather deck, superstructure, and so forth. And she was towed by the lure line off to Hawaii and used as a water tug or a barge. Her engines were taken out, and she hauled water and molasses around Oahu, Waikiki, and Honolulu, out to vessels riding an anchor, and occasionally was used to haul other things. But in 1923, she was towed out and scuttled. So here she is on her way out to be scuttled. And I believe it was in 2015, the University of Hawaii went out, did some survey work. They were located her about 1,400 feet off Diamond Head. So she did wreck, but not off San Diego, not off Hawaii. So that concludes the presentation. Are there any questions? Jim?
Two questions. For Holland, the fourth time?
D. Holland? Yes, yes.
And the second question is, the shipbuilder Palmer, is that is he a successor to Roach, or is it a separate shipbuilder?
That I'm not sure of. I'd have to research that.
Yeah, as a general comment, I think the COO would have been glad that I wasn't on the board of inquiry. He wouldn't have been exonerated. No way. No way.
Yeah, there's about 10 charges against Vince Wade and about a dozen or so Lucian Young, the master, the commander aboard the vessel. They charged him with neglect, basically dereliction of duty for not having checked. And this was basically circumstantial event at the time. They did find that the captain was more or less, not, he was doing the job as he should according to regulations. Wade, the chief engineer, was a different story.
Well, you said it yourself, the captain of the ship is ultimately responsible. Almost every single thing that happens on a ship can boil down to somebody wasn't properly trained to do the job.
Yes.
Head guy on the ship, he's responsible for training every single guy, even the guy that just walks aboard and doesn't know how to turn it on. The captain is responsible. Unfortunately, that's the way it is. He also has a moral obligation to the crew not to take that ship to sea if he thinks it's unsafe, and let the chips fall where they may. If somebody says your ship is really safe and you should have taken it to sea, then he finds a new job. But he had a moral obligation to that crew and he's disregarded it. He should have been dropped out. That's just a personal opinion.
A very strong.
Just a second. What's interesting though is, now there's a lot of boiler-related disasters at the time where they had type of fatalities, but I haven't been able to find one similar to this. So it's kind of like icebergs ahead. Okay, we'll slow our speeds, we'll just be careful. It's not something that was known to happen, the boilers were known to be in bad condition. I don't think at the time they had the foresight to realize that such a disaster would occur, based on prior history.
Well, those fire tube boilers have been around for a long time, and I noticed you didn't really say anything about all the other sister ships they have, and sister ships all had those, fire tube kind of boilers. They had mega problems.
Oh, yeah, the boilers were problematic. They didn't have the catastrophic explosion they had.
Well, you said it yourself, though, there was a bunch of events that led up to it. And
Yes.
if you would have stopped any one of those events, you always gotta believe your gauges. If your gauge reads 0, believe it, and then find out what's going on.
Yes.
Believe it, believe your indications.
Yes.
That's one of the first things they teach you in engineering at Annapolis. So he should know that, even if he wasn't. Even when you talk about the amalgamation of putting the junior officers in charge of that. Yeah, that's one reason that our Navy takes heat, because if you go to the Canadian Navy or the British Navy, you got engineering officers. You go to engineering school, they stay in engineering. They never set foot on captain of the bridge. Our Navy, going back to what you're saying, we wanted it both ways. We wanted engineering and deck officers amalgamated together, so when the captain gets up to the bridge, he knows a lot about engineering. Still like that. You still got a 22-year-old down there in charge of the main propulsion division on a ship, and he's got guys working for him anywhere from 18 to 42, and he's in charge. Okay.
Good question?
Well, thank you, Captain, for your historic report. But 50 years ago, I was on the USS Orion, DD-725, and we escorted an aircraft carrier called Bennington
Yes.
from Long Beach to Da Nang, South Vietnam. So there was another ship named the Bennington in modern history.
And she also had a big fire explosion. Some hydraulic fluid from her catapult caught fire and exploded. And with a loss of 110 lives back in the 50s. And there was another tanker named Bennington, which also had a fire and explosion. So Bennington have not had a good record for fires and explosions.
Well, it's a popular name on the ship.
Yes. Popular American event in American history as well. Yes.
Was, I read about, I'll wait for you to get the article about the USS Maine years ago, but I'd completely forgotten, but was that boiler explosion that they, modern day historians theorize, was that in any way related to maybe the steps that led to this boiler explosion, or was that a different type of thing altogether? Or maybe it was actually the weapons on board that actually ignited, I don't remember actually.
I believe it was munitions.
It was the ignition, so it wasn't the boilers then?
Correct.
Okay,
Yes.
okay.
Now, in this case, despite the explosion, it was relatively contained. In other words, it happened in the engineering spaces, there wasn't a lot of damage done elsewhere on the vessel. Now, if the boiler were truly overpressurized and had split down the seam, it would have been much more like the main explosion. It would have taken out decks, taken out half the ship. Because when you have 6,000 gallons of water explosively vaporizing the steam at 160, 200 psi, it's catastrophic events. That could take out half the ship.
Yeah, even a lot less pressure.
Yes.
Yeah, flashes right away.
Yes.
Yeah, you read about boilers go to 12, 15, 20 pounds of pressure. Destroy an engine room. Go outside the ship, yeah.
There was a video, in fact, I saw this guy make a presentation. Madman Mike, he has his own home-built rocket, goes up the desert, launches himself up into 2,000 feet. He has 100 gallons of water, he heats up to 450 psi, and then releases the pressure. Explosively vaporizes the steam, that's the propulsion, 2,000 feet. So it's a huge amount of force. Any other questions? Yeah, it is a flat earth guy, yeah. Quite a character, but I was trying to get that presentation, the video that demonstrated the fact that the pressure of the explosive vaporization steam can be like. Question?
You mentioned that, excuse me, the Medal of Honor was awarded to
11.
11 crew members. Was any of the crew that died awarded the medal posthumously?
No. No, because the explosion happened so quickly that those that died usually were victims of the steam explosion itself, as opposed to they were able to help and rescue. There was some controversy. There was when the crewman got here, who went down into the forecastle to cut the dead end off the chain. The reason being is that she was an anchor, and they needed to move the vessel to beach her to try to save the vessel, and possibly men trapped on site. So he went down and cut off the end of the chain, and later succumbed to lung damage not a day or two later. And so suggested he should receive the Medal of Honor, and did. But for the most part, there was none that was awarded posthumously.